Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia 90b. Bava Metzia, actually, today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia Tzadi Aleph 91, but we're going to start on 90b, 5 lines from the bottom. Daf yomi is dedicated for a Shmira for Am Yisrael, a Tzala for the Shliyim, Yeshua for the Chayalim. So we're going to start on Tzadi Aleph Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. Gemara says, Itmar Chosma B'Kol. Let's say a person, we know that you're not allowed to muzzle your ox when it's working, your animal while it's working. But let's say you don't muzzle it physically, but you muzzle it with your voice. Like you say, don't eat. Or hinhiga bakol, you're not allowed to work and two different types of animals together, a shore and a hamor. You can't work an ox and a donkey together, for example. Well, let's say you just led them together with your voice, but didn't actually lead them with the reins. So Rabbi Yochanan Omer Chayev, Rabbi Yochanan says that you're liable even if you just do it with your voice. And Rish Lakish Amar Pater, Rish Lakish says you're exempt. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev, Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable because Akimas Piv, Ravi Maisa, just moving your lips is considered an action and therefore you're going to be responsible. You did the action. And so therefore it's going to be considered, Rashi says, a prohibition where with an action related to it, and you would get the lashes. Whereas Rish Lakish says you're potter, he says you're exempt. Kolo having ma'aseh. He says the sound of your voice making a sound, that's not considered like you did an action, and therefore you're not liable. Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. So Eitzvei Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan, who says that voice is an action, he challenges Rish Lakish from the first Mishnah in Mesechas Tamura. Okay, what is a Tamura? We're on top of 91a. A Tamura is where you have an animal that's dedicated to be a specific sacrifice in the temple, and then you say, I take this animal and I transfer its holiness onto a different animal. So you're not allowed to do that. But if you do that, that's called a tamura. It's called an exchange. And then the first animal retains its holiness, and the second animal also has holiness. But you're not allowed to do it. And if you do it, you get the lashes. As it says the Mishnah, Moshe Adam Rashayla Hamir, he's not allowed to do it, Elashim Hamir, but if he does do it, he's considered like it is mumar, it is exchange. For Sofig gets Arbaim, and he gets the 40 lashes. So we see from here that even though you just did a voice, you get lashes. So Amrulay, Rish Lakish responds to Rabbi Yochanan, no, that position in the Mishnah in Tamura, Hamani, who is that? That's Rabbi Yehuda. He Amar Lav Shein Bo Ma'isa Lokanav. That's Rabbi Yehuda who says that if it's a prohibition without an action, you're going to get lashes. So the Gemara says, Umi Matzis Mukmas La Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, do we really want to say that this position, this Mishnah and Tamura is like Rabbi Yehuda? Hakatani Reisha. But the first clause of the Mishnah states, Hakol Mamirin Echad Hanashim ve'Echad Hanashim. But the first clause of that Mishnah says who can do the Tamura, both men and women. The word Hakol is coming to include Asuye Yoresh. It's coming to include that even an heir who inherits a sacrifice from his father, he's also capable of effectuating this Tamura. And that's not like Rabbi Yehuda. Dik Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Yorish Eno Mamir. Rabbi Yehuda says that the heir cannot do the Tamura. So the first clause of the Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda because our Mishnah says an heir can do it, and Rabbi Yehuda says an heir cannot. Because we said, Amar Yorish Eno Mamir, Yorish Eno Somach. He says the heir cannot do the Tamura, cannot do Smicha, the laying hands on the animal. So the Gemara says, no, the simple answer is Haitana, the author of our Mishnah, he argues with Rabbi Yehuda in one aspect, and he agrees with him in the other aspect. He argues with Rabbi Yehuda with respect to whether or not an heir can do the Tamura, but he agrees with Rabbi Yehuda that you get lashes even though there's no action associated with it. And Rish Lakish says, I don't have to hold like that position of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, Hachosim Esapara, Vidashpa. So you borrow or you rent a cow from your friend, and you muzzle the cow, and then you work the animal. So you're going to get you get lashes because you muzzled the animal while it was working. And you have to pay the owner of the animal because it was your responsibility to feed the animal while you borrowed it. And so By muzzling the animal, you didn't allow the animal to eat. So therefore, you have to pay the food that you owe the owner of the animal to the owner of the animal. So the Gemara says, but why? We have a general rule because it says in Torah Risha, so for one wickedness you're punished, not two. It's called Kimle B'Deramine. We only give them more severe penalty. So you don't get lashes and die, and we don't give you lashes and make you pay. So this is a case of if we're giving you the more severe punishment of lashes, why are we making you pay? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara is going to have three answers. Amar Abaye, first answer, money. This is Rabbi Meir Hida Amar Lokum Mishayim. This is the position of Rabbi Meir Meseches Makos, who says that even though we don't give you two punishments, when it comes to lashes and payment, there we do say you get two punishments. That's the first answer. It's based upon the fact that it says in Meseches Makos, if witnesses come forward and testify that falsely that their friend owes 200 zuz, so since they testify falsely, they get lashes, and they pay if they're found to be false witnesses. That's the answer of Abaye. Rava gives a different answer. Esnan or Asra Torah, Rafil Baal Imo, that a case of an Esnan, Torah prohibits if a woman is a prostitute and she gets a payment, that payment is called an esnan. So the Torah prohibits that from being brought as a sacrifice on the altar. But Rava says that even where it's going to be a case where a person had Rahman al relations with his mother, and he gives her this payment is still called an esnan, and it's prohibited on the temple. Even though the punishment for the mother is more severe, obviously, that even though it's more severe, the punishment of being with one's mother, nevertheless, the payment is still going to be applicable. And so that's what Rava is saying. So here too also, even though we're going to say, even though there is the aspect of the cow that you're getting lashes, your personal payment that you owe somebody is going to be liable. You still have to pay. There's a question, is it mean that you're actually liable, or you're liable to pay by the laws of heaven? Or we say, Rashi says, if you seize it from the person, then it cannot be reclaimed. But the basic point is that we're saying that even though you get a penalty, if you have a personal responsibility to pay someone, that personal responsibility is not wiped out by the fact that you have a more severe penalty. Rav Papa says, Rav Papa gives a third answer, Mishas Mashicha Chayav Lebim Midanosah, Umilko Lucky Achas Lasima. Rav Papa says, no, there's two separate acts. From the moment that you draw the animal towards you, that's when you have to pay for its food. But from the moment you muzzle it, that's when you get the lashes. So they're two separate moments. So once we cite this position of Rav Papa, the Gemara cites some other teachings of Rav Papa, which is a little strange because Rav Papa appears very often in the Shas. But so why all of a sudden from here does the Gemara want to give us random statements of Rav Papa that are seemingly unconnected, but the Gemara decides to give it? So the Gemara says, what are these statements of Rav Papa? Amar Rav Papa, Hani mili ba minai derbe Rav Papa bar Abba pashtu hu isura. So he said, these statements were asked from me in the yeshiva of Rav Papa bar Abba, and I answered these questions and said they're prohibited. Chada kehochasa. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Okay, so I answered all these. Oh. Okay, so he said, I was asked all these questions, and I said they're prohibited. One is halachically prohibited, and one is I'm just being strict, but it's not really halachically prohibited. So what were these questions? They asked him the question, are you allowed to knead the dough in milk? Basically, can you make milchik bread? And I said it's prohibited. And this is this is the law. It is actually prohibited to make dairy bread. Titania, you're not allowed to knead the dough in milk. And if you do need it, the entire bread is going to be prohibited, even just to eat it without any other food. It's going to be prohibited. Because what might happen is you might come to eat meat with it, and so therefore you're not allowed to make dairy bread. So if anybody wants to serve you dairy bread, it's not kosher. Of course, there are some leniencies for it. If the bread looks significantly different, is one of the reasons, or if it's a very, very small piece of bread, another reason. But the basic law is that dairy bread is very, very problematic, and you shouldn't accustom yourself to dairy bread. As Rav Papa says, it's prohibited. Number two thing was kayotzi bo ein tashin es atanar ba'aliyah. You cannot take the fat of the tail of the animal and use it like a grease to grease the oven. And if you did, koapas kua asura. And if you did, all the bread is prohibited ad sheyasik es atanar, until you burn out the oven. And here too, the problem is that people won't realize that the oven is fleshik, and then they're going to take the food and eat it with dairy, because you have the problems there from the grease in the oven. You have the steam, the smell. It's a big problem. So, okay. The idach. What was the other thing that they asked? They asked me a question. Min v'she'eno mino l'dir. And the question was, can I put two animals? One is two different species. Let's say one's a donkey, one's an ox, into the same corral, and I know that they're going to mate. But I didn't do it. I just put them in the same corral, and it's basically like putting non-kosher food in a pot, and somebody else is going to turn on the stove. And I said it's prohibited. But technically speaking, it's permitted. To Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel said menafim, meaning to say, I said it's prohibited because I didn't want people to come and actually do the prohibition. But technically speaking, it's permitted. How do I know this? The Amar Shmuel menafim, when it comes to adulterers, you don't have to actually see them physically committing the act of adultery. Until you see them lying down in the manner that adulterers would typically lie down. But you don't have to actually graphically see them engaging in the adultery. Just lying on top of each other is sufficient. And when it comes to the prohibition of two species, like an ox and a donkey, there you have to see actually like the graphic mating, like sticking of a twig into a hollow tube. So Masav Rav Achadvoy bar. So Rav Achadvoy bar. So this was challenged. How was this challenged? So Rav Achadvoy bar Ami challenges this because it says in the pasuk, if the pasuk had just said you're not allowed to mate your animals, I would have said, Adam I might have thought that you're not allowed to help one animal mate another animal, even just like two sheep. I wouldn't be allowed to hold them while they're mating. It says no, you're not allowed to mate the two different species, the ox and the donkey. Doesn't this prove the Koyim Achiza Namilo that by Koyim? So doesn't this prove that by Koyim it's also going to be prohibited? Meaning to say, not actually doing the actual mating, that sticking the twig into the tube, but rather even just holding them by Koyim, that should be prohibited. So therefore, if that's the case, that you wouldn't be allowed to stick them into the corral together. So the Gemara says no. My achiza, when it says that by Koyim achiza is prohibited, there it means hachnasa. It means like the sticking of the twig into the hollow tube. And v'amai karle achiza. So why is it called achiza? Lishna ma'alya. The Gemara wants to speak in a appropriate language, in a refined language. It doesn't want to speak in vulgar terms, even when it's just referring to animals. The Gemara does not want to speak in vulgar terms. So therefore, it says by Klaim, you're not allowed to do achiza, but it really just means that you're not allowed to actually mate the animals. That's the prohibition, that you actually do the mating with your hands. You allow the two animals to mate. Amar Yehuda, min b'mino mutar lachnis k'machal shofaris. By Kalayim, there you're not allowed to actually mate them, but by two kosher animals, you're allowed to actually, basically cause them to physically mate. And it's not going to be prohibited. It's not prohibited because of licentiousness. That we know that in general, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah tells us, "Lo yistakel b'chamor b'chamora b'chazir b'chazira b'shah shehin misdavgin." That Rashi says that when it comes to non-kosher when it comes to animals, you're not allowed to watch them mate because that's considered to be pretus. It's licentious because you might come to start to think inappropriately. But actually in this case, you're allowed to help them mate. Why? Because you're involved in work, and basically you're not thinking about the licentious thoughts. You're just thinking about how I can mate them. There's no like certain leniencies that, generally speaking, a person not supposed to touch a person from the opposite gender. But in case of where you're a doctor or things like that, you're involved in your profession, it's allowed because of avidasitar. So Masiv Barami, so he challenges this because it says on top of Tzadi Alpha base, it says if it just says your animals, you cannot mate. I might have said you're not allowed to hold the animals so that they can mate. Tamalom kulayim. By kulayim hu da'aser. By kulayim it's prohibited. Hamim b'mino shari. But if it's two of the same species, it's permitted. Hamim b'mino nami. And even when they're the same species, achiza in. You could, generally speaking, hold them, but achnasa. But to actually manipulate the genitalia of the animals, that far I would say is prohibited. The Gemara says no. My achiza. Well, my achiza. Achnas. So when the Mishnah says that when the Midrash Halacha says achiza, it means hachnasa. It doesn't mean holding. It means causing the animals to mate. Why is it called achiza? Which the Gemara wants to speak in a refined language, and so therefore it calls hachnasa achiza. Amar Rashi, Hamilsa Balminai Debei Rav Nechemia Reish Kulusa Mala Hachnes Min Umino V'Sheino Mino V'Dir. He says, okay, they asked this question from Rabbi Nechemia, who was the Reish Kulusa. Are you allowed to bring a min and a mino V'Sheino Mino? Let's say, are you allowed to bring? Even though we just said you shouldn't put like an oxen and donkey in the same corral because then they'll come to mate. What if there's three animals there? There's two oxen and a donkey, a male and a female. Of the ox and the donkey. Is that going to be allowed? So keeping the ikamine basar minegar. So once it sees its own type there, maybe that's the one it'll mate with. Maybe no, it's still going to be prohibited. And I said it's prohibited, not even though not technically prohibited, but we say it's prohibited because we don't want the servants to see this. And then when they see this, then they're going to just do two different species in the corral together. Okay, so now we're up to the Mishnah. Let's say, remember we had said that the worker is allowed to eat while they're working. Well, let's say he's working just with his hands, and now with his feet, or with his feet, but now with his hands. A few big seifo. Even if he's just carrying stuff, he's allowed to eat while he's working. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, he has to be working with both his hands and his legs in order to eat. My timer, what's the reasoning? What's the reasoning that Tanakama says it doesn't matter if you're working with your hands or your legs, you can eat? Because it says when you come into the vineyard, however you come in, however you work. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, you need to be doing it with both your hands and your feet. My time is Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. He says, Kishor. He says, we learn it out from the ox, the manner in which the ox works. Just like the ox, when it works with both its front legs, which are considered the hands, and its back legs, which are the feet. So to a worker has to be working with both his hands and his feet. So by Rabbi Ravuna Dash Bavazim Etarna going to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Mao. So let's say, according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, it requires both the front and the back feet, in the front hands and the feet, in order to be liable for the prohibition of otachsom shor v'disho. On a muzzle, let's say if it's a goose or a chicken that is you're using it to jump on the berries. Mao, do we say because kocho ba'inan? Do we say you require all of its force, and there it has all its force, va'ika? Odelmo, or perhaps biyado barago b'inam va'aleka. But in this case, there's no hands; it's just legs. Or maybe we require both the hands and the legs. Mara says, take them. We leave that question unresolved, so we have to be strict. Amar Nachman, Amar Barafua, Polim, Achlo, Helchu, Shesi, Erev Begas, Ochan Anavim, Vein Shosin Yain. So here we're talking about the case of you're crushing the grapes, and after you crush the grapes, it turns into wine. So the Chiddush of what Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav Baravua is that the workers, they can only eat the grapes while they're stamping on it until they walk back and forth in a crisscross manner, which is called Shesi Ve'erev. That's they refer to a cross in medieval rabbinic literature. Is called Shesi Ve'erev. So until you walk back and forth, you can only eat the grapes. You can't drink the wine because the wine is only made when it's the crisscross. But once you do the crisscross, then you can eat from the grapes and drink the wine because now you're engaged in both processes. So now we're up to the next Mishnah. Let's say you're working on the figs. You can't eat the grapes. You're working on the grapes. You can't eat the figs. But what he is allowed to do, and the Gemara is going to basically dissect this Mishnah, but for now we'll just read it. But he's allowed to hold himself back until he reaches the better place, and eat there. When you're allowed to eat is only during the time of the work. So technically speaking, you're only allowed to eat while you're working. But because we want to return the lost object to the owners, we don't want them to stop working in the middle and eat, because then he's not going to be able to work. So we want to make the owners whole. We want to return the lost object to the owner. So therefore, therefore we allow the workers to eat while they're walking from one row to the other. Rashi says when they finish this row and they go to the beginning of the next one, even though at that moment they're not working, the owner prefers that, because that way they're not taken off from work. So therefore, for that reason, and also when they come back from the wine press, and also when you unload the donkey. We'll see what all that means. So first the Gemara asks, let's say you're working on one grapevine. Can you cut down a cluster of grapes from a different grapevine and then bring it back to your place and eat it from the place where you're working? Do we require that it's the same type of food that you're putting in your, in the bag that you're collecting for the owner? And that's what's going on here. Or maybe it has to be the exact food itself that you're putting into your bag, and this is not the exact food because you're going down the road to get from the other food. And if you want to say, and if you want to say, well, if you're working on this grapevine, you can't go to a different grapevine and eat it. Well, if that's the case, how can an ox ever eat? How is the ox ever able to eat? Because the ox is tied to basically like a yoke or a instrument in front of the wagon, and the people are harvesting in the back of the wagon or next to the wagon, so they're not in the exact same place. So how is the ox ever able to eat? So Amar Rav Shesha B'Rei Ravidi. So the first answer is, it says Rav Shesha in the name of Ravidi, he says bis racha, that the way they're able to eat is with basically a very long branch that reaches from the workers all the way to the ox, and that's how they're able to eat. So the Gemara says let's try and answer this question from our Mishnah. So it says if you're working with the figs, you can't eat the grapes. But if it will be two sets of figs, but they'll be in two different places, like grapes and figs, then it would be allowed. So we see, if you want to say that if you're working on one grapevine, you can't eat from another, how does that work with the fact that our Mishnah seems to allow you allowed to eat figs even if they're in two different places? So Amar Avshisha Braid Ravidi. No, that case is talking about bemudlis. That's talking about mudlis. So that a mudlis is basically that the branches of the figs are basically mixed together with the other figs, and so therefore there you're allowed to eat it. So look at Rashi. Rashi says, that you're really only allowed to eat from what's in front of you. And the fact that it says the grapes and the figs, and we apply from there that figs and figs you can eat, that's talking about fig that's intertwined with the grapevine. And the Mishnah is teaching us that you can eat from the grapes, but not from the figs that are connected to that grapevine. And even though he's working on both of them, basically the figs are falling onto your grapevine that you're working on. And even though you're working on both of them because you need to pick up the figs in order to eat from it, nevertheless, it's not what you're hired for. And so therefore, that's not going to be basically allowed. So that's the first answer. Tashma, the Gemara tries to bring another proof of Omonea Asatzmom. It says that the worker is allowed to hold himself back until he gets to the better place and eats there. And if you say if you're working on one grapevine, you could work on the other one, you can eat from the other one. So let him just go and eat there and bring it back. Why does he have to hold himself back? First, no, there the concern is mishum bittul malacha. We don't want him taking his time and walking back and forth. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, that we're not asking about. So the Gemara says, no, that we're not bothered. Of course, you can't go and take off work. The problem that we're asking about is so there, the question would be whether if your wife and your child can bring it to you. So that was the question of them. That's what the Mishnah was talking about. Not a case of where you want to go and hold yourself back and go bring it from that place and bring it to your other. Obviously, that'd be prohibited. So we're not asking about Bito Malacha. We're asking about whether your wife and children can bring it to you. Tashma, another attempted proof from our Mishnah. That really you're only allowed to eat during the time of work. So technically speaking, you can only eat while you're working, but because we want to make the owners whole, we say you're allowed to eat in between rows and while you're walking back from one place to the other. So Savrua, so the people in the yeshiva assume, the Bnei Yeshiva assume, that while you're walking, it's like you're working. That technically speaking, that the only reason why you can eat it is because it's to the owner's advantage. But biblically speaking, you can't eat. We see from here that if you're working on one grapevine, you can't eat from the other grapevine. So it's just that we're allowing you to eat because it's to the advantage of the workers. But technically speaking, you wouldn't be able to eat in one place if it's the food from the other place. The Gemara says, no. So technically speaking, even though you're working on one grapevine, you can eat from another one. And while you're walking, it's not like you're working. And alternatively, alternative version is they said walking is not like working. The reason biblically speaking you can't eat, it says mishum is because you're not working. But if you would be working, that means you biblically be allowed to eat. Doesn't this prove that you could eat from one grapevine to another? Gemara says no. really, if you're working on this grapevine, you can't eat from another grapevine. And while you're walking, it's like you're working. And the Gemara now says, we'll just finish up to the Mishnah, B'chamor kashipo rakas. And the donkey, when you're unloading it, then the donkey can eat, and you know how to muzzle it. So the Gemara says, when you're unloading the donkey, that's when the donkey could eat. So the Gemara says, kashipo rakas mehechanacha. If you're taking the food off the donkey, then where's the animal going to eat from? There's no food there. And it's a very quick thing to do. So Rashi says, Kol masa porkum pasachas, you do it all at once. And the Ravid says, once you take off the stuff, it's done. You're done with your job. So how's it going to eat? So Gemara says, no, you can eat the donkey. The donkey can eat until it's unloaded. Also, we have a similar brisa. It says the donkey and the camel can eat from the burden that's on their backs, as long as the worker doesn't give it to them with their hands. Because then, if the donkey's eating it, it's going to be eating last. Okay, we'll stop here. Shkoyach to everybody. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.